This is where you work.
This is where I work, yes.
You read and you write.
Actually, I write here in the mornings, and I do my reading usually elsewhere in the house because I read prone. I usually am lying down or I'm propped on a sofa, so my reading is elsewhere. But this is where I write.
How much writing and how much reading?
Well, I usually write now from preferably early in the morning when my brain is clear into the early afternoon. 2 or 3, it depends on where I am in a project. And then I read for 2 or 3 hours, sometimes as much as 4, if I push back the writing. And of course, if I'm doing a nonfiction piece, I'll also do research at my desk. That's why books are open, and I often have piles of books that I've thrown to the one side while I'm in the middle of working.
What happens to you when you get into the research period?
It's very intense for this most recent book, The Shaking Woman, or A History of My Nerves. I relied on a lot of research I had done for many, many years. I mean, reading philosophy and psychoanalysis and some neurology. But I also did do specific research for the book. I looked up a lot about conversion disorder or hysteria, although I had again done research on that earlier. So it's an ongoing process.
These 2 books are closely linked.
They are in many ways closely linked. It's absolutely true. One is a work of fiction, one is a work of nonfiction, but nevertheless, they're connected. I think the obvious connection is through my father. Because he was dying when I started writing The Sorrows of an American. And The Shaking Woman opens when I'm giving a little memorial talk and suddenly have a seizure. And I ask myself, what is going on here? But they're quite different as well, because The Sorrows of an American is a novel. The Shaking Woman, I use my own autobiography or my own case really to explore much larger questions about who we are. So probably only 10% of the book is directly telling my story, and 90% is going through other literatures.
Yeah, because seemingly it's incredibly personal, but still it's something different as well.
Yes, it's actually both personal and impersonal, and I use the title The Shaking Woman or A History of My Nerves, to indicate the double position. The Shaking Woman is the third person, and then there's the my nerves, which is the first person possessive pronoun. So I wanted to have that dialectic, and it's very much present in the book. It's personal and also highly impersonal, third person and first person.
We've met once before on a balcony at Key West.
That's it. Yes, I remember.
Yeah.
I remember.
With your husband at the balcony, and we were. What surprised me was to suddenly write about Key West in this book. Something happened there.
Yes, when you were there and I was there, I gave a talk that came out of a lecture I had given at Columbia Medical School, way uptown in New York. They have lectures that are given by doctors, but also by writers, novelists. It's in a department called Narrative Medicine. So I was elected to give a speech, and I wrote about the shaking episode that had only happened once in terms of 3 disciplines: neuroscience, psychoanalysis, and psychiatry. And I said, here is a symptom, let's look at it through these 3 lenses and see what comes of it. I did not have any shaking problem at Columbia. I cut that speech in half to make it more available to a lay audience, or people who are not inside medicine. So it was half an hour instead of an hour long. I stood up to give it. Same thing. Huge convulsions and shaking.
Yeah, describe it. How much
What
is
was
it?
really, well, it's very hard to explain. My husband had never seen it, and he was stunned because I had told him how bad it was when I gave that earlier speech, and I don't think he understood. But it's really big convulsions, that your body is out of control.
The voice then?
And the voice stayed the same. Now, in Florida, I felt that there was a threat that this shaking was just sort of going to consume my entire body. But I heard people in the audience saying, you know, things like she's having a seizure, she's shaking. So I paused and I said, listen, I know, and I'm going to address the shaking later in the talk, which was a bizarre moment, but what I didn't really know what to do. I thought, well, maybe if I can get to the end, it will go away as it did before. And slowly as I talked, the shaking began to subside. So by the end of the talk, it was over, which was a very good thing indeed. And I had no idea again what had happened to me.
Does it frighten you when it happens?
Well, you see, that's the strange thing. I didn't feel very frightened by it. I felt I really felt, as I say in the book, I felt as if I were two people. This calm, thoughtful speech giver and an out of control, shaking body beneath. So there was an experience, I think, something like dissociation. In other words, dissociation is a broad psychological term for being removed from present reality. But I wasn't that removed because I managed to give the speech. So it was very, very peculiar. And I began to ask myself, what is this? Again, I mean, I'd already asked it, but now the repetition made it a more difficult problem. So rather than just diagnose myself as I had been doing before, I went to real doctors. Yeah.
And after having written a book, do you know the answer? Do you have an exact answer?
No, I don't have an exact diagnosis. I think that many people have asked me this, even so far. I've been in Germany and England for the book. A diagnosis is satisfying, but there are many names for illnesses that have no known cause. So you can give a name to an illness without knowing what causes it. Many instances of this. So although it's comforting, I'm not sure that just naming a condition changes it all that much.
So having educated yourself in these fields, you know so much that you aren't able maybe to be happy with a diagnosis. You have too much knowledge in a way.
Well, it's extremely interesting to think about what a diagnosis is in itself, and I do ask that in the book. So in order to make a diagnosis, you have to, in a sense, abstract illness from the person. So this is already a false category in some way, because you can't really remove, for example, with cancer, people sometimes can remove the cancer from the person and he or she can recover. Other times the cancer is so invasively present that to say this is cancer and this is the person becomes a moot point. The same with many neurological illnesses. Headaches, for example. How do you distinguish the headache from the person? Most people don't think about illness in this way, but by writing the book, and certainly through thoughts that I had had earlier, I think it's a question, a philosophical question that people might ask.
I've read some very interesting articles on the New York Times website.
About the migraine pieces? Yeah.
And your conclusion is that you had to stop struggling it.
Yes. Well, especially with a non-fatal illness. I've never had a fatal illness, so I really cannot talk about that in any personal way. I think that would be immensely difficult, and it's possible that some kind of campaign or war to live could help people at moments like that. With chronic illness, such as my migraine, the turning point for me was when I realized that this is not an alien invader. This is part of the economy of my personality, and a neurological weakness that I will probably always have. And as soon as I did that, I actually felt less pain. I also learned to do something called biofeedback, which is a form of behaviorist meditation, essentially. And that also helped me to reduce my pain and feel that I had some control over it. Not total control, but giving way or giving up to the reality of a chronic illness, I think can be a much better solution than most people imagine.
So it helped you?
It helped me, yes.
But does the migraine bother you every day?
No, although I have gone through periods of, for example, waking up every day with the migraine, which often then subsides after coffee. I was just traveling in Europe for this book. I was gone for 11 days. It was extremely intense. From one interview, one reading to another, very little time to relax in between. And the Sunday after I returned home, I had an enormous attack, which lasted for a few days and now is much better. So this is classic. I have to say, I've come to recognize it. It's not that I'm expecting a migraine. It's that when it comes, I say, oh, well, this is typical. You've been in a state of high energy, working very hard, talking a lot, and it's not at all strange that you have a collapse, a migraine collapse afterward.
So the migraine was, well, not an old friend, but it's something that you've known for a long, long time.
Absolutely, and I feel that I know what to do when it arrives. And above all, I don't panic about the pain. And I used to. I always had that thought, well, it will never go away. I have this forever. And that creates tremendous tension, which then exacerbates pain.
Where does it come from, you think?
Well, migraine apparently is what they think of as a primary genetic inherited illness. Whether they're right about this, I'm not sure, but I have certainly read that a number of times. So you have what I think of as a predisposition to get migraines. I'm not sure that means at all that you necessarily get them. There may be people who have a genetic predisposition who then go on to live such calm lives that they never get a migraine possibly, or they are never, the migraine is never brought out through external stimuli. But in my case, that's not so.
But the shaking, that was something new.
Yes. No, this too. Yes, the shaking was definitely new and very peculiar. And I did originally treat it as something wholly alien to myself. But writing the book in some way helped me to think through, a question of the self and illness. And to some degree, I think I did it for that reason. I feel that I can take ownership of this shaking person.